So for a start, we understand that climate change and sustainability and climate finance is never only about emission reductions. Obviously, all countries, especially the richest countries, need to reduce emissions to keep the temperature rise below 1.5 degrees. But addressing climate change requires solutions that deliver other co-benefits, addressing issues around equity, poverty, gender, pollution, inclusion, and making sure that we meet as well the Sustainable Development Goals. Because essentially we know that climate finance is about climate justice. It's very closely linked. We know that developed countries, the richest countries, and fossil fuel companies, other polluting companies like the cement kilns or incineration industry have the biggest responsibility on the emissions that are already in the atmosphere, creating climate change and already creating impact on the most vulnerable communities in the world. And therefore, these are the players that have an historical debt with developing countries that are suffering the most of the impacts of climate change. So this should really be always our starting point when we talk about climate finance, acknowledging this historical debt that has not been paid, and actually pretty much the opposite is constantly being blocked from advancing. So how does this play out in the waste sector? Essentially, the main trend that we see is that in the waste sector, we have a clear example of double standards. On the one hand, we have the European Union, which is taking very positive steps actually in making sure that climate finance goes to the right solutions in the waste sector. And yet, in contrast, what we see is that many EU countries and other rich countries still promote the most polluting technologies in the global south in developing countries. So this is what I'm going to flesh out today. This climate financial trend that we see in the waste sector, how the climate finance in the EU is moving away from pollution, and yet how is this pollution still exported to the global south. So just to summarize, like the key thing for us is not only the amount of climate finance, which definitely there's a big question. We know that the 100 billion promise is insufficient, but also to what kind of solutions, how green is the climate finance that we're seeing, as Arti was saying at the beginning. So just to provide a bit of context of what I'm talking when I say climate action in the waste sector, how does this look like? We have on the one hand, the linear economy. This is the current dominant and sustainable system that keeps the materials economy based on the extraction, on the production, on the disposal of products, mainly using incineration of waste and landfill. This system, to have an idea of how many, the contribution to climate change is up to the 62% of global greenhouse gas emissions. If we take into account all the life cycle of products in all these different phases. On the other hand, we would have a zero waste circular economy, where the actions at the top of the waste hierarchy, that is waste prevention, reuse, and recycling, have a considerable scope, a lot more significant to reduce emissions because they are reduced upstream. And in particular, food waste that is estimated to be, food waste is estimated to be a third of all food produced, and reducing we could reduce emissions between 0.8 and 4.4 tons of CO2 per ton of waste, of food waste prevented. So pretty significant, especially when food waste is related to the emissions of methane that comes from landfills. But as we were saying earlier, we cannot only talk about emissions, and definitely we approach the waste sector from a systemic point of view. So on the one hand, we're talking about this traditional waste management, very centralized, very expensive, with very capital intensive infrastructure that burns or landfills waste, producing a lot of toxics, and that creates a system that locks this waste generation because it's an infrastructure that needs to receive a constant amount of waste. So very unsustainable. And on the other hand, we have the zero waste system, decentralized, prioritizing the treatment of waste as locally as possible, putting the people at the center, creating jobs. We see in many cities around the world with zero waste initiatives that reuse, repair, recycling, increase, have a much more significant amount of jobs produced per ton of waste treated. And it identifies and reduces waste as a main priority. This includes, for example, plastic, for example, single-use plastic, the need to reduce single-use plastic, the production of virgin plastic as a key action in climate change. And of course, it prioritizes in this way, and it allows for waste prevention policies to move on. It doesn't lock in the system in the way that the other traditional systems do. Just to put more emphasis actually in developing countries, that is the informal recycling economy that supports thousands of livelihoods in developing countries. So supporting the integration of waste pickers into formal waste management systems is a fundamental field of work, and it's something that any climate finance should be very aware of, and should make sure that there is a strong component around inclusion of informal recycling economy. So, and finally, in terms of health, just to mention that incinerators are a really important source of dioxins, of furans, a heavy metal. I mean, essentially, incineration just creates the same landfill in the sky and produces toxic ashes. So this is really an impact on into the ecosystems, onto the public health, especially of children and the elderly. So this is important when we avoid incineration. Is also, we are talking about all the health benefits that we have for the communities. So looking at more specifically at the climate finance and in the waste sector, what is the trend that I was talking about? I'm going to flesh out a bit the main point that I was saying before, in which we see that there is a positive trend in the north, in some countries, specifically in Europe and generally in the EU, in that climate finance is moving away from the polluting technologies, and yet we just don't see that happening in the global south yet. Where is this coming from? Why is this happening? Is because actually the history of incineration in Europe goes way back. Rich countries in Europe have invested in this technology, in waste to energy incineration, to the point of reaching overcapacity. There is too much incineration for too little waste. So countries like Denmark, Germany, Sweden, that have also commitments to circular economy and to climate change, have realized that waste to energy incineration is an obstacle to meet the policy commitments that they have. So these industries, the polluting industries, then need to expand their markets and look to expand their markets onto the global south, where developing countries are pushed to accept polluting industry in many times on climate grounds, as if this was a good technology for the climate. And I want to flesh out, like, just to give you all the specific precedents where we see like how all the institutional and financial moves that we see, that how this finance is moving away from incineration and the reasons why they're doing this. So we have to go back to 2011, actually, when the European Commission launched the roadmap for resource efficient Europe. This time, already the Commission said that incineration with energy recovery should be limited to non-recyclable materials, in a way acknowledging that when you have an incinerator, in fact, it will have a vacuum cleaner effect. It will really take a lot of recyclable materials and they will be burned, which is obviously really inefficient and unsustainable. There was a really hot debate in Europe, and in 2017, the Communication on Waste to Energy was a document trying to answer some of the controversies around incineration. And already this document by as well the European Union recommended for rich countries, this kind of countries that have overcapacity, to make incineration more expensive, to phase out public support schemes for waste to energy incineration, and use the money to support the upper tiers in the waste hierarchy, specifically putting a moratorium on any new facility. This was definitely really important and very positive step. Even more concretely, the Renewable Energy Directive, the legislation that had been allowing renewable energy subsidies going to incineration, which is a scheme that we see often recommended in developing countries because it's very important for incinerators to make money out of these renewable energy subsidies as if they were doing renewable energy, which is not true. Precisely, this is why the revision of this legislation in Europe approved phasing out these subsidies to waste-to-energy incineration, especially if the separate collection targets had not been met. So that was like a big setback to the whole business model of incinerator that relies very much on renewable energy subsidies. Then in 2019, we saw the European Sustainable Finance Taxonomy. This is a very important milestone in sustainable finance in Europe because it established a classification for what are the economic activities that are eligible to receive sustainable finance. And these are the activities that have to comply with a number of environmental objectives, amongst them not harming, like supporting the circular economy, not producing pollution, obviously supporting climate change mitigation. And in this classification explicitly excluded incineration or disposal of waste as it understood that it was undermining these environmental objectives. This is a basic legislation that has had consequences for many other financial institutions that have had to adapt their criteria. Like, for example, the European Investment Bank, that as well had to exclude waste incineration from its financial support because it had to reconcile their policies with the EU taxonomy regulation. And this had consequences as well for the kind of projects that were supported, like the European Investment Bank that took the money away from a very controversial waste incinerator that had been on the cards in Belgrade in Serbia. And precisely the money was taken away because it was said this incinerator will harm the circular economy and the recycling goals that Serbia needs to comply with in order to become an EU member. So we've seen how already very positive steps, how some of the projects that our allies, in this case, Bankwatch has been an organization looking very closely following this fight in Belgrade, have seen how this has been very positive step. But there's been many others. The Just Transition Fund, precisely a fund in the EU that supports the transition to the climate transition. In its regulation, it was produced in 2020. It was clearly stated that waste incineration is excluded from financial supports as it belongs to the bottom of the hierarchy of the circular waste economy. Also, the EU Cohesion Fund, the European Regional Development Fund. These are funds that are meant to level up the disparities amongst the regions and countries in Europe. All of them have said explicitly that they cannot support investments that aim to increase the capacity for residual waste treatment, including waste incineration, precisely because, for the same reasons, because it harms circular economy, etc. The Recovery and Resilience Funds, which was set up for supporting the economic and social impact caused by the COVID-19 pandemic. Again, the construction of new waste incinerators is excluded as a recipient of aid because of the threats to circular economy and other and higher performing options like reuse and recycling. So all of these precedents have, show how waste-to-energy incineration has been excluded from climate finance, sustainable finance in the EU. And the main reason has been that it is a very carbon-intensive process that undermines the efforts to reduce emissions and therefore to meet the climate targets that countries have in Europe, and also because it undermines the transition to a circular economy and it becomes an obstacle to reuse, recycling, waste prevention, repair, etc. But, and this is the big but, despite all these precedents, we still see how EU countries still promote waste to energy incineration in the global south on climate. And this is something that our members alert us again and again, and that keeps coming up in our campaigns. We see it in the Philippines, in Indonesia, in Vietnam, in Brazil, in China, in Argentina. There will be an incinerator proposal that has some sort of support by European company or a European country, an embassy. Sometimes it's the United States as well. But definitely, this is always like really important to be aware of these double standards and to recognize that waste to energy incineration is not suitable either for the developing countries. This conversation happened very explicitly in the context of the Climate Bonds Initiative. The Climate Bonds Initiative also produced the criteria for climate bonds in the waste sector, and it excluded incineration in the bonds in Europe, but it explicitly allowed them to be raised in developing countries on the ground, saying that incineration can be a transition technology and ultimately it diverts waste from landfills. We strongly opposed this conclusion, and definitely this is part of our work, is to continue pushing back on the promotion of these polluting technologies in the global south, because what we see in Europe, what we see in developing countries, and especially in Asia, is that definitely what we want is for climate finance to go to all these zero waste solutions, which have a much greater benefit in terms of climate change mitigation, adaptation, and it supports all these cool benefits that we've been talking about. And this is where we see that the climate finance should be going. And this is the criteria that we definitely want to make sure that it's taken home by policymakers and financial institutions. Zero waste is thriving in Asia as well. And these are some of the case studies that we've been working on, with impressive cases in the Philippines, in Fort Bonifacio, in Kamikatsu in Japan, Bandung in Indonesia, Kerala in India. In all of these places, some of the key criteria that we've been seeing and that has been working, giving impressive results, is that these are decentralized systems that lead to a higher recovery rates, making sure that there is resource separation. It supports waste prevention policies, and specifically it tackles single-use plastic with bans to some of the single-use products, and also making sure that we are tackling the reduction of plastic production at the source. These are systems that are people-powered and that put community in the center, providing livelihoods to empower waste pickers and other workers in the waste sector. It is cost efficient. It is definitely a lot better for the public funds that have a lot better value for the money that they have. And it reinforces this commitment to phase out incinerators and waste to energy technologies in any other forms. So just as a conclusion, I would just wrap up to saying that I hope it's been clear that the zero waste solutions provide the greatest benefits for climate change mitigation, adaptation, and co-benefits, and that this is the climate finance in the waste sector that needs to be channeled to these solutions instead of waste to energy incineration, especially in developing countries. And this double standard that we're seeing definitely needs to be stopped. These developed countries and rich countries need to honor this climate debt that they have and ensure that the climate finance commitment deliver on both climate and sustainable development, not only in the amount of money that needs to be delivered, which is absolutely fundamental, but also in the kind of activities that we see that need to receive this climate finance to deliver on the important policy objectives that we have on climate and sustainable development.